This is a story about two men. One is 28, still bleeding from a love that left him hollow. The other is 59, carrying a silence so practiced it has almost become peace. One moved into a flat on Adabo, close looking for a fresh start. The other had lived there long enough to become part of the walls. Nobody would have written them together. Not Lagos, not their families, not even themselves. And yet...
Welcome to Love Tales with Cynthia. Please do well to subscribe, like, and share as we begin the story.
Grant Adeyemi moved into the Adabo Close apartment on a Tuesday, which felt appropriately unglamorous for a man trying to disappear. He had one suitcase, 2 boxes, and a particular exhaustion of someone who had loved badly and survived it. Chitty, the name he would not say aloud for at least another month, had taken the apartment, the dog, and 3 years of Grant's certainty about who he was. What remained was a 28-year-old man standing in a doorway that smelled like fresh paint and someone else's cooking. The building was modest. 4 flats arranged around a small courtyard where a mango tree grew without apology. Grant liked that about it immediately. Something alive in the middle of concrete. He was dragging his second box up the stairs when he heard the door, the flat 4 be open. You'll pull your back doing it that way. The voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had stopped rushing somewhere along the line and never started again. Grant looked up. His neighbor was tall, silver hair at the temples, with the kind of face that had clearly been handsome at 30 and had simply deepened since then. He wore a plain white kaftan and held a cup of tea as though nothing in the world required urgency. "I'm fine," Grant said, which was the automatic lie of someone who was not fine at all. "I'm John." The man nodded, not extending a hand, not intruding, just present. "Flat 4B. We share the corridor." Grant. A pause that was somehow not awkward. "There's jollof on the stove," John said, "in case you haven't eaten." He went back inside before Grant could answer. Grant stood in the corridor for a long moment, box still in his arms, something unnamed moving in his chest like weather about to change. He told himself it was just hunger. John Okafor had lived alone for 11 years. He had constructed the solitude carefully, the way a man builds a wall not to keep others out, but to keep himself in. After Ngozi left, after the lawyers, after the long season of everyone in his life having opinions about his grief, John had chosen quiet the way other men chose religion. He was 59. His business, a small architecture firm, ran itself efficiently. His days had shape. His nights had books. He had convinced himself this was enough. Then the new tenant arrived looking like a wound in a good jacket. John noticed things. It was an architect's habit. Reading structures, finding where the pressure was concentrated. The boy, man, he corrected himself, carried tension across his shoulders like scaffolding. Early 30s, maybe, beautiful in a way that seemed to inconvenience him. John brought the jollof to the door, knocked once. Grant opened it looking surprised, as if kindness was something that still caught him off guard. They ate on the small balcony that connected their flats, a design detail John had always found pointless until now. Grant talked about Port Harcourt without mentioning why he'd left it. John talked about Lagos without mentioning how long he'd been stranded in it. "You live alone?" Grant asked. 11 years. "You don't seem lonely." John considered this. Lonely and alone are different countries. You can visit one without living in the other. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been living in both." The mango tree rustled below them. Somewhere in the building, a television laughed at something. John felt something shift, a structural thing, deep in the foundation. He recognized it the way you recognize an old song, with equal parts pleasure and alarm. He refilled their glasses and changed the subject. Grant had a rule, no more feelings. It was a clean rule, practical. Chitty had burned through his capacity for vulnerability the way a careless tenant burns through a security deposit, completely and without apology. Grant had decided he was closed for renovation, indefinitely. But the body doesn't negotiate with decisions made by the wounded mind. It was 3 weeks into living on Adabo Close. Grant was returning from a run, earphones in, sweat damp and deliberately empty, when he nearly collided with John in the courtyard. John had been crouched beside the mango tree, Examining something in the soil, a crack in the foundation, he explained, an old one he'd been monitoring. Structures speak. John said, still crouching, not looking up. You just have to learn the language. Grant, breathless from a run, looked down at the silver-haired man speaking softly to a building's bones, and felt something arrive in his chest that he had absolutely no framework for. Not this, he thought. Not him. Not. You're staring. John said mildly, finally looking up. I was just... Grant gestured vaguely at the tree. John stood. They were closer than expected. The courtyard was small, the moment smaller. John's eyes were kind of dark that had depth in them, not just color. Come, I have groundnut soup on. It was the simplest sentence, the most dangerous one. That night, eating in John's kitchen, which smelled of wood smoke and old paperbacks, Grant had a thought he immediately tried to smother. I feel safe here. He hadn't felt safe in a very long time. Walking back to his flat, he stood at his own door and gave himself a clear, firm talking to. John was 59. John was male. Grant had never. He wasn't. He went to bed and dreamed about the sound of John's voice. John had a system for not feeling things. It had served him faithfully for a decade. The system involved early mornings, strong coffee, drafting plans for buildings, and a studied indifference to anything that couldn't be measured or resolved by sundown. The system had survived Ngozie's departure, his son Emeka's prolonged silences, even the death of his oldest friend 2 years ago. The system was not surviving Grant. It wasn't a dramatic unraveling. That wasn't John's way. It was quieter. A Tuesday morning when he caught himself wondering if Grant had eaten. A Thursday when he heard the young man's laughter through a wall and felt something loosen in his chest like a long-held breath. He was 59 years old. He understood desire. He had not misplaced it somewhere in the last decade, only shelved it. But this was more inconvenient than desire. This felt like recognition. One evening, Grant knocked with a broken smoke detector and a sheepish expression. John fixed it in 4 minutes. They ended up on the balcony again. Their balcony. John had begun thinking, which was the first warning sign, talking until the neighborhood went quiet around them. What happened to you? Grant asked eventually. Before the 11 years alone. John was quiet for a long moment. Marriage, he said. A good one for a while. Then a bad one for longer. Then nothing. You never wanted someone again? Not until recently. The thought arrived precisely and unwelcome. I thought I'd outgrown the wanting, John said carefully. Grant turned to look at him in the low balcony light. His face was open, stripped of the careful distance he usually wore. Do we outgrow it, he asked, or do we just get tired of being hurt? It was the most honest question John had heard in 11 years. He didn't answer, but something in him answered anyway. It happened on a rainy Friday, which felt appropriately cinematic in retrospect. The light had gone in Grant's flat, a wiring fault in the old building, and he'd knocked on John's door with his laptop and a casual shrug that fooled neither of them. They settled at John's dining table, Grant working, John reading, the rain doing its Legos business against the window. Around midnight, Grant fell asleep over his laptop. John covered him with the throw from the sofa, stood there one moment too long, looking at the young man's sleeping face. The tension finally gone from it, the jaw unclenched, the whole architecture of him softer in sleep. He went to bed. In the morning, he made tea for two without thinking. When Grant appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair disheveled, blinking at the prepared cup, something passed between them that words would have only spoiled. I should go, Grant said. He didn't move. You should have tea first, John replied. Grant stepped into the kitchen, took the cup. Their fingers didn't touch. John made sure of that, but the proximity was its own argument. John. Grant's voice was low. Careful. I don't know what... He stopped. Try it again. I feel something I can't explain. The room contracted. I know, John said quietly. Does it... Grant looked up. Does it frighten you? John looked at this 28-year-old man holding a cup of tea in his kitchen on a Saturday morning, looking at him the way people only look when they mean it. Terribly, John said honestly. Grant let out a breath that might have been a laugh. Set down the cup. He didn't lean in. John didn't either. But when their eyes met, unhurried, unguarded, certain the way that precedes all the uncertainty, both men knew, without a word, that something had already begun. The days after that Saturday had an altered quality, like light through a different window. They didn't speak of what had passed between them. Instead, they circled it, the way people circle a fire when they want warmth but respect the burn. Dinner happened again, then a walk, then an evening at John's drawing table, where Grant watched him sketch a renovation concept and forgot entirely that he was supposed to be somewhere else. It was Grant who finally named it. They were on the balcony. The city hummed below. John had been quiet for a while, which Grant now understood as thought, not distance. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Grant said. Matter of fact, like pulling a splinter. John went very still. "You should know what that means," Grant continued, voice steady in a way that must have cost him something. "You should know I haven't said that easily. I said it to someone who didn't deserve it, and it broke me. So he exhaled. "I'm telling you carefully." John turned to look at him. "I'm 59, he said. "First, because it mattered. I know how old you are. You're 28. You have... Don't tell me what I have." Quiet, firm, young and certain in a way that made John ache. "Tell me if you feel it." The city breathed below them. "I feel it," John said. Simply, irreversibly. Grant nodded slowly, like a man receiving news he has been waiting for. He reached across the small space between their chairs and placed his hand over John's. Briefly, deliberate, a question answered by the way John turned his palm upward. Not a beginning. A confession of what had already begun. They sat like that, hand in hand in the dark above Lagos. Two men with no roadmap and, for the first time in both their lives, no desire to find one. She arrived on a Wednesday. Grant didn't know who she was at first, only that the woman standing in the courtyard below was elegant, 50s, and looking up at John's balcony with the focused energy of someone who'd been saving up a conversation for a long time. John's face, when Grant saw it, told him everything. "Ngozi," John said from the balcony. Flat, unsurprised, tired. She had heard things. A neighbor, someone from the old circle, had seen John and Grant at a restaurant in Lekki, had reported back. Ngozi had driven 3 hours from Ibadan with the specific purpose of understanding what she'd been told. She came upstairs. Grant moved to leave. John said, "Stay." The conversation was almost civilized until it wasn't. "You have a son," Ngozi said to John. "You have a name in this city. And you are doing this? With a boy who is younger than our marriage was. Grant is not your concern. He is very much my concern if you are about to embarrass yourself and everyone connected to you." Her eyes moved to Grant then. "Cool." Assessing. "Does he know what he's getting into? Do you know what he is?" Grant held her gaze steadily. He had met versions of this before. "I know exactly who he is," Grant said. She turned back to John. Something shifted in her face then, past anger into something rawer. "I'm asking you to stop this before it becomes public, before Emeka finds out, before..." Her voice caught, almost imperceptibly, "before I cannot protect you from it." John was quiet for a long moment. "Ngozi," his voice was not unkind. "You left. That door closed." She looked at them both. Grant's hand resting near John's on the table, the domesticity of the kitchen behind them, the unmistakable shape of something real. When she left, she took the quiet with her and left the thread in its place. Ngozi's message came 3 days later. It was brief. She had photographs, taken from outside the restaurant in Lekki, angled through glass unmistakable. She would send them to Emeka, to the firm's board, to the pastor who had once blessed her marriage. She wanted nothing material. She wanted this stopped. Grant read the message over John's shoulder. He waited for himself to panic. Instead, he felt something clarify, the way a river runs cleaner after the rain has done its worst. "She's hurting," John said. "She's threatening us." Both things are true. He set down the phone. "I know Ngozi. This is grief dressed as control. 11 years ago when she left, I think she believed I'd wait, become a statue of the man she'd married." He paused. "Finding out I'm this, that I've found this, I think it has rearranged something in her story about us. That doesn't make it acceptable. No, it doesn't. Grant walked to the window. Lagos in the afternoon, loud, indifferent, alive with people living in every possible way. What are you afraid of? Grant asked, if she tells people. A long silence. Emeka, John said finally, my son thinking less of me than I hope he does. Not the firm, not the city. I've lived in this city long enough to know that scandal is seasonal. It passes. He moved to stand beside Grant at the window. My son is permanent. Grant turned to him. This man, 59, silver, serious, the most surprising person he had ever loved. Then we call him first, before she does. On your terms. John looked at him for a long moment. You're very brave for someone who claims to have given up on feeling things. John said softly. Grant almost smiled. You did that. You fixed that. John reached up and touched his face. Just once, just briefly. An acknowledgement. A choice. John called his son on a Sunday morning. Grant sat in his own flat on the other side of the shared wall and tried to read and could not. He heard nothing. The walls were thick. John's voice was low. Only the duration of it. An hour and 14 minutes, by the clock on his phone. When John knocked, his face was unreadable. Then it wasn't. He said. John stopped, swallowed. He said he had suspected something was different about me, since I was young, that he'd noticed, and he had chosen not to ask because he thought I would never. His voice thinned. He said he was not losing his father over this. Grant exhaled something he had been holding for days. He wants to meet you, John added, something between disbelief and wonder in his voice. I'd like that. John crossed the sofa and sat down heavily, not in collapse but in release. The particular way a man sits when he's been carrying weight. So long, he has forgotten what it was like to put it down. Grant sat beside him. Ngozi sent the photographs. John said, to Emeka, before we called. He got them the night before. He sat with it all night. And he called her. A sound that was almost a laugh. My son called his mother and told her that her grief was not permission to destroy people, that as she continued, she would lose him too. He shook his head slowly. He's a better man than I raised him to be. You raise him fine. Grant. He turned. His eyes were full, but his voice was steady. I spent 11 years believing I was done with this, with feeling loved, with being known, that I'd had my portion, and spent it. He reached over and took Grant's hand. Thank you for not accepting that. Outside, the mango tree in the courtyard stood in the Lagos afternoon sun, growing without apology, as love, when it is serious, insists on doing 0.6 months later. Grant was still in flat 4A. He stayed not because he had nowhere to go, but because here had become specific. The mango tree, the shared balcony, the sound of John on a call, voice moving to the wall like architecture. They had not made announcements. They were not interested in performance. What they had was a quieter claim. Sunday mornings at the same table. Evenings with a balcony held both their silences. The ordinary miracle of being known without explanation. Ngozi had stopped, not warmly. There was still a formal distance, a wound that would scar before it could soften, but the thread had withdrawn, turned in on itself. Perhaps Emeka had something to do with that. Perhaps time did. Emeka had visited in the 5th month, a tall, composed young man in his early 30s who shook Grant's hand, asked him what he did, and spent 2 hours at the table talking architecture and music and the particular difficulty of inheriting a parent's silence. When he left, he hugged his father at the door for a long time without speaking. Grant had looked away to give them that. That night, John had been quiet in a particular way that meant full, not empty. Grant had learned to read the difference. Are you happy? Grant asked. John considered it seriously, the way he considered everything. I am present, he said finally. After 11 years of curating my absence, I am completely, uncomplicatedly present. I think that is what happiness actually is. Grant leaned his head on John's shoulder. Outside, Lagos made its relentless music. Inside flat 4B, 2 men who had no business finding each other, too young, too old, too scarred, too different, were finding each other anyway.
Thank you for watching. Every unexpected love has a moment when it had to choose between the safety of what people will think and the risk of what this actually is. Grant and John chose the risk quietly, repeatedly, on an ordinary balcony above an ordinary city. Perhaps you have a love story that broke the expected pattern in age, in gender, in timing, in geography. A love that arrived when you had stopped setting the table for it. Tell that story. Someone needs to hear it. Because the most important thing the story knows is this: love is not a reward for those who followed all the rules. It is, more often, a gift delivered specifically to those who finally stopped. If this story touched you, let me know in the comment section. Also, do well to subscribe, like, and share. See you on our next story. Bye for now.